At first, nobody in Pompeii understood what was happening. The mountain had always been there. They knew it as Vesuvius, a familiar shape rising above the Bay of Naples. Vineyards covered its slopes, roads passed around it, houses, shops, temples, and wealthy villas filled the surrounding countryside. People had lived beside the mountain for generations. Then, in the summer of AD 79, the ground began to shake. Not once, again and again. Walls cracked, objects fell from shelves, buildings were damaged. People were frightened, but earthquakes were not unknown in Campania. The region had experienced them before, so life continued. Markets opened, bread was baked, people walked through the streets, merchants prepared their shops, somebody painted advertisements onto walls, somebody was eating a meal, and somewhere inside the city, people were making plans for the next day. They had no idea they were living through the final hours of their city because Vesuvius was preparing to explode. When the eruption finally came, it transformed Pompeii from a living Roman city into something almost impossible, a city frozen in time. But the popular story of Pompeii is incomplete. For decades, people imagined that everyone simply suffocated beneath a giant blanket of ash. That isn't what happened. The eruption was far more complicated. Because the volcano didn't destroy Pompeii with one single blast. It attacked the city in stages. First came the sky, then came the darkness, then came the falling debris, then came the heat, and finally came the pyroclastic currents that swept through the region with such speed and temperature that survival became almost impossible. What happened at Pompeii was a chain reaction, and the evidence is still sitting where the Romans left it. Pompeii was founded centuries before Rome reached its greatest power. By the 1st century AD, however, it had become a prosperous Roman town. Its location was extraordinary. Pompeii sat near the Bay of Naples, close to major ports and fertile agricultural land. The surrounding region produced wine, olives, fruit, and other goods. Wealthy Romans built villas nearby. The city itself had streets, shops, temples, baths, theaters, restaurants, workshops, fountains, and private houses. It was not a primitive settlement waiting to be destroyed. It was a functioning Roman city, and that matters. Because when we look at Pompeii today, we aren't looking at ruins that slowly developed over centuries. We are looking at a city interrupted. Imagine walking through Pompeii on the morning of the eruption. You would hear carts moving through the streets. You would smell bread baking. You might see merchants opening their shops. You could pass a public fountain and see people collecting water. You could walk past a tavern where customers were eating and drinking. Political campaign messages were painted directly onto walls. Pompeii was noisy, crowded, messy, alive. And then Vesuvius erupted. The first stage was spectacular. A massive column of volcanic material rose into the atmosphere. Modern scientists often compare its shape to a giant umbrella or pine tree. The eruption column climbed many kilometers into the sky. At first, enormous amounts of pumice began falling over Pompeii. Pumice is volcanic rock filled with bubbles. It is surprisingly light, but when enough of it falls, it becomes deadly. The streets began filling. Roofs began collapsing. People had to make a decision: stay inside or leave. This is one of the most important facts about Pompeii. Not everyone died. Thousands of people escaped. They saw what was happening and fled the city. Some left during the early stages, while roads were still usable. Others waited longer, and that delay may have cost them their lives. Because the eruption continued for hours, the sky became darker. Ash and pumice covered the streets. The falling material became deeper and deeper. Inside buildings, people tried to protect themselves. Some sheltered beneath roofs, others gathered their possessions. Some attempted to escape. The archaeological record shows evidence of all these choices. And then the city began to collapse. Literally. Pompeii's buildings were not designed to support meters of volcanic material. As pumice accumulated on rooftops, structures failed. Tiles crashed down, wooden beams broke, walls collapsed. People who had survived the first phase could suddenly become trapped inside their own homes. But the worst was still coming. And this is where the popular image of Pompeii becomes misleading. The victims were not all killed in the same way. Some died from collapsing buildings, some were buried, some may have suffocated from ash and volcanic gases. But others were killed by something far more violent: pyroclastic currents. A pyroclastic current is a fast-moving mixture of extremely hot gas, ash, and volcanic particles. It can move at extraordinary speed. It rushes across the landscape and can overwhelm buildings and people before they have time to react. When these currents reached Pompeii, the situation changed completely. People who had survived for hours suddenly had almost no chance. The temperature was extreme, the material moved quickly, and the city was overwhelmed. This is one reason the victims of Pompeii can be so difficult to understand. They were not all killed at exactly the same moment. The eruption unfolded over time. Different parts of the city experienced different stages. Some people escaped, some died early, some survived the falling pumice only to be killed later by the hot currents. Some buildings remained standing, others collapsed. Pompeii was not buried by a single event. It was buried by a sequence, and that sequence created one of archaeology's greatest time capsules. Because the same volcanic material that killed people also preserved their world. Think about what normally happens to an ancient city. Wood rots, food disappears, paint fades, cloth decays, metal corrodes. People remove valuable objects. Later generations build on top of the ruins. Eventually, much of what made the city feel alive disappears. Pompeii was different. The eruption buried enormous parts of the city so quickly that many objects were protected from ordinary decay. A loaf of bread could remain where it had been left. A piece of furniture could be preserved. A wall painting could survive. A shop could remain recognizable. Even graffiti could survive, and the graffiti is especially fascinating. Because the walls of Pompeii were not silent. People wrote advertisements. They supported political candidates. They insulted one another. They recorded jokes. They left personal messages. Some inscriptions were extremely ordinary, and that is exactly why they matter. History usually preserves the words of emperors, kings, generals, priests, aristocrats. But Pompeii preserves the voices of ordinary people. A Roman city was not just temples and statues. It was people arguing, selling, buying, gossiping, advertising, complaining, falling in love, and sometimes simply writing something stupid on a wall. Pompeii preserved all of it. One of the most famous discoveries is the bakery. Archaeologists found bakeries with large stone mills used to grind grain. In some cases, ovens and bread were preserved. There are even loaves of bread that were carbonized during the eruption. They are not ordinary bread anymore, but their shape remains. Imagine making bread in the morning, putting it into an oven, and then never returning. Almost 2,000 years later, archaeologists open the building and find traces of the final routine. That is what makes Pompeii so powerful. It doesn't just show us how Romans built things, it shows us what they were doing when history stopped. The same thing happens in houses. A wealthy Roman home could contain painted walls, courtyards, gardens, fountains, sculptures, dining rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, and storage spaces. The paintings reveal mythology. The mosaics reveal taste and wealth. The architecture reveals social status. And the objects reveal everyday habits. Pompeii even preserves evidence of food. Archaeologists have found remains of fruits, grains, fish, meat, and other foods. Carbonized material from kitchens can reveal what people were eating. This means Pompeii can answer questions that written history often cannot. What did ordinary Romans eat? How did they decorate their homes? What did their shops look like? How did they organize their kitchens? What did they write on walls? What did they sell? Where did they work? How did rich and poor people live differently? Pompeii gives us pieces of the answers. But perhaps the most haunting discoveries are the human remains. When volcanic material buried bodies, the soft tissue eventually decomposed. This left cavities inside the hardened ash. In the 19th century, archaeologists realized that these cavities could be filled with plaster. The result was a cast, preserving the shape of the person at the moment of death. These casts became one of the most famous images associated with Pompeii. But there is something important to understand. The casts are not literally bodies turned to stone. They are impressions. The volcanic material formed around the body. The body eventually disappeared. A hollow space remained. Archaeologists filled that space, and the result captured the final position of the victim. A person curled up, another lying face down, a child, a family, a person apparently trying to protect themselves. These images are disturbing because they remove the distance that usually separates us from ancient history. A statue is easy to think of as ancient. A broken column is ancient. A coin is ancient. But a human-shaped void is different. It reminds us that Pompeii was not a story about ruins. It was a story about people. And another misconception is worth correcting. Pompeii was not simply a city of wealthy Romans. It contained people from very different social backgrounds. There were wealthy property owners, merchants, craftsmen, workers, enslaved people, freed people, children, foreigners. The city reflected the complexity of the Roman world. Some houses were enormous, others were small. Some people lived in luxury, others lived and worked in much simpler conditions. The eruption captured that social world at a particular moment. But then there is the question that has fascinated historians for centuries. Why didn't everyone leave? The answer may be partly psychological. People do not always respond rationally to disasters. If you have lived beside a mountain your entire life, a few earthquakes might not convince you that your entire world is about to end. If the eruption begins with falling stones and ash, you might believe you still have time. If your home is filled with valuables, you might try to collect them before leaving. If you have elderly relatives or children, you might wait. If roads are crowded, you might hesitate. And if you have never seen an eruption of this scale, you have no experience telling you what comes next. The people of Pompeii were not stupid. They simply did not know what was coming. There was no modern volcano monitoring system, no emergency broadcast, no satellite images, no evacuation plan. They had only what they could see, and what they saw was probably terrifying. Darkness, ash, lightning inside the eruption cloud, falling rock, earthquakes, noise, smoke, and a mountain that had suddenly become something else. The destruction also extended beyond Pompeii. Nearby Herculaneum was devastated as well. But the two cities were not preserved in exactly the same way. Herculaneum experienced different volcanic deposits and conditions. In some places, the deposits were much deeper. Wooden structures, doors, furniture, and other organic materials survived remarkably well. This gives archaeologists another perspective on the eruption. The catastrophe was regional. It wasn't simply Pompeii versus Vesuvius. The entire landscape around the volcano was transformed. Villages disappeared, agricultural land was buried, roads were destroyed, people were displaced. And then, remarkably, the world moved on. The Roman Empire did not collapse because Pompeii disappeared. Rome continued. Emperors changed. Wars were fought. New cities grew. Generations passed. The eruption became history. Eventually, Pompeii was largely forgotten beneath the ground. Vegetation returned. People lived in the surrounding region. The buried city became part of the landscape. For centuries, most people did not know exactly what was beneath their feet. Then, in the 18th century, excavations began to reveal the remains. At first, archaeology was not the science we know today. Excavation could be destructive, objects were removed, walls were exposed without always recording their context. The goal was often treasure, art, statues, and spectacular discoveries. But over time, archaeological methods improved. Pompeii became something much more valuable than a collection of beautiful Roman objects. It became a laboratory for understanding ancient life. Every layer could tell a story. Every wall could contain evidence. Every discarded object could reveal something. And modern technology has made the city even more valuable. Scientists can analyze volcanic deposits. Archaeologists can study human remains. Researchers can examine food residues. Digital mapping can reconstruct buildings. Advanced imaging can reveal details earlier excavators couldn't see. And every discovery can change our understanding of what happened. One interesting development concerns the exact timing of the eruption. For a long time, the traditional date was August 24th, AD 79, based largely on ancient textual evidence. But archaeological evidence has raised questions about the precise date. Some discoveries, including seasonal fruits and clothing, have suggested that the eruption may have occurred later in the year. This has led to continuing debate among researchers. And that is an important lesson about Pompeii. Even when we think we know the story, new evidence can force us to reconsider it. The volcano itself wasn't finished. Vesuvius has erupted many times since AD 79. The mountain that destroyed Pompeii is still an active volcano, and millions of people live around it today. That creates an uncomfortable connection between the ancient disaster and the modern world. Pompeii is not merely an archaeological curiosity. It is also a warning. Volcanoes do not care how advanced a civilization is. A Roman engineer could build an aqueduct. A Roman architect could construct enormous buildings. A Roman administrator could govern an empire stretching across continents. But none of that could stop a volcano. And there is something else Pompeii teaches us. Civilizations are usually remembered through their greatest achievements. We remember emperors, armies, monuments, temples, wars. But sometimes the most revealing evidence comes from the smallest things. A loaf of bread, a painted wall, a child's object, a cooking pot, a forgotten shop, a message scratched into plaster. These details turn history into something human. Pompeii is extraordinary because the disaster preserved both extremes. At one end, you have enormous villas decorated with elaborate paintings. At the other, you have simple kitchens and crowded workshops. You have temples built for the gods and graffiti written by people who clearly did not care about posterity. You have political advertisements and private jokes. You have beautiful mosaics and ordinary rubbish. Together, they reconstruct a city more completely than almost any other ancient site. But the most haunting part of Pompeii may be what we can never know. We know the volcano erupted. We know the city was buried. We know many people died. We know many others escaped. But we will never know every individual decision made during those final hours. We don't know exactly what every person saw. We don't know who ran first, who waited, who turned back, who searched for family, who believed the danger would pass, who understood what was happening, and who never had the chance to understand. That uncertainty is what makes the ruins feel strangely alive. The streets are still there, the houses are still there, the bakeries are still there, the graffiti is still there, the ovens are still there, and in some places you can still see the marks left by carts traveling across the ancient streets. You can walk through a doorway and stand where someone stood nearly 2,000 years ago. You can look into a kitchen and see where a Roman family prepared food. You can enter a house and see paintings created for people who believed they would wake up the next morning and continue their lives. They didn't know they were creating an archaeological time capsule. They were simply living. And that may be the greatest tragedy of Pompeii. Not that a city died, but that the people inside it had no reason to believe they were living through the final day. They woke up, they worked, they ate, they talked, they argued, they made plans, and then the mountain erupted. The world they knew disappeared beneath ash and volcanic rock. But almost 2000 years later, their world is still speaking. It speaks through the walls, through the streets, through the food, through the graffiti, through the objects abandoned exactly where they were used, and through the human remains that remind us that behind every archaeological discovery was once a living person. Pompeii was not simply buried, it was preserved, and that distinction changed everything. The volcano destroyed the city, but in destroying it, Vesuvius accidentally created one of the most detailed records of ordinary ancient life ever discovered. The ruins are not a perfect photograph of Roman civilization. They are one frozen moment. A city caught between one ordinary day and the end of everything it knew. And perhaps that is why Pompeii still feels so unsettling, because when you walk through its streets, you're not looking at a civilization that vanished thousands of years ago. For a moment, you're looking at a civilization that was interrupted. The people expected tomorrow. There was no tomorrow. But their city remained, waiting beneath the earth, waiting for someone to uncover it. And almost 2000 years later, we are still walking through the final day of Pompeii. If stories like this keep you curious, stay close. There is more buried in history, waiting to be found.